Hello. Hey everyone. I am Sam Battenally. I'm one of the founders of Rise. I'm here to talk about open-based sequencing. So for some context about Rise, we're a very, very high-performant based layer 2, EVM-based layer 2. But I'm not here to talk about Rise. I'm here to talk about the based ecosystem and kind of where it's at now and where things are going to go. So yeah, disclaimer, I am an engineer, I'm not a cryptographic researcher, so I'm looking at this from the angle of we want to deploy in the based ecosystem, and we know what tools are available, and so really just trying to connect the dots and do something sooner rather than later, so very tangible and pragmatic is the mindset that we tackle this from. So the talk before the panel, Jason gave a rundown about base sequencing, so I won't spend too much time on it. But at a high level, it's a sequencing option where you essentially provide or delegate the rights to sequencing to the Ethereum validator network. So it's purely Ethereum validators have the sole right to sequence your transaction. So it's kind of like leveraging Ethereum to be a shared sequencer for your network and other based rollups. What makes base sequencing unique? Is it shared sequencing? Not really. Is it L2 synchronous composability? It's cool, but you can do that with other shared sequencing. Is it the best validator network in the world for sequencing? That's also debatable. The 12-second block time is kind of a pain in the ass, and it doesn't have fast finality, which other sequencers do. So I wouldn't consider any of that, any of those qualities to really a USP for base sequencing. What I do think is really important for base sequencing is one, L1, L2 synchronous composability. This is essentially the only way you can do it. Because it's the Ethereum validator sequencing your transactions, you're able to bundle up transactions between the L1 and L2 and do like cross-chain interop between the L1 and L2, which is cool. It's difficult to say how powerful this will be until we see the apps that use it in the future. But what I think is actually the most important feature of base sequencing in the based ecosystem is the fact that it's credibly neutral. There's a lot of secondary effects to credible neutrality. So put yourself in the shoes of someone deploying a rollup. Let's look at the options, the kind of decision tree you have to go through. So the first question is, do you want to decentralize? Do you want to decentralize your sequencing stack? I actually think that there is plenty of use cases where you can continue to use a centralized sequencer. It's just use cases that can afford to have lower liveness or censorship resistance. However, if it is important to you to centralize your sequencer, I think the next question is neutrality important? And for many, I think the answer is like maybe. It's kind of in the middle. So I think it's actually other questions are more important, so like the quality of the ecosystem and things like that. So it's not obvious today why base sequencing is a really high quality option for sequencing your rollup. I'll get into the reasons why though, the nuance there. But one thing I just want to highlight is there's one thing that will make base sequencing terrible. Terrible is probably over the top, but will limit its potential, and that is if we don't have synchronous composability within the based ecosystem. So this is the idea that someone can deploy a rollup and have synchronous composability with other rollups in the ecosystem without being under the same umbrella. So this, I've kind of been alluding to what I see as the potential for an open-based ecosystem. Open meaning permissionless, for participation being the key requirement. Second to that is, like I said, open synchronous composability, that you can synchronously compose with other rollups in the stack. This is really, really hard, number two. I'll dig into that more later. The costs need to be similar to centralized sequencing. We operate in a world where liquidity will flow to where is most efficient. So if the costs are too high, we just aren't going to be able to attract the liquidity within the based ecosystem. Next to that, I think it's important to have DA agnosticism, that rollups should be able to use Ethereum DA or external DA. And then finally, there's this cool idea of zero-cost bootstrapping. This is kind of an outcome of all the others, that there's a world where the based ecosystem gets to a point where you can deploy a rollup and it costs nothing to deploy. It's really the transactions and incentives of the permissionless based sequencers that can jump in and sequence your blocks for you. So how do we get there? First thing we have to do is for a whole lot of teams to come together and actually agree on some of these standards and build this out. Fortunately, Justin Drake essentially made this his mission last year to bring together all the teams within the base sequencing, base sequencing and pre-confirmations domain. And the culmination of that was actually last week called Sequencing Week in Chiang Mai, where a whole suite of teams came together. The teams I've put here, I apologize if I've missed anyone, these were the teams that worked on the API specifications. There were plenty more teams, but it was awesome to have so many people come together and actually tackle some tough challenges. And what that looked like is that we selected a handful of the top challenges to tackle and broke out in teams and worked through them. One of the major outcomes of this was we were able to produce a pre-conf API standard. So the goals of this standard is that rather than having many different pre-confirmation standards, we can kind of unify. It means that relays builders have the same API to interact with gateways, and then potentially also down the tree you can have more composability. But a high level here, this will be familiar to a lot of people in the room, but at a high level, you delegate you delegate rights to provide constraints to a gateway, and then that gateway from that point can essentially provide pre-confirmations to users. This is super valuable, or essentially absolutely required for base sequencing, because a base roll-up that has 12-second confirmation times is just completely unviable, so you need to have pre-confirmations. One thing that's unclear about this, actually one thing I just want to update, if you didn't see, Justin Drake shared a tweet yesterday where a bunch of the teams actually came together and got the first mainnet transaction. Some of the people that pulled that off, Lorenzo, the man, he made it happen, are actually in the room. So yeah, that was awesome effort, but it's kind of like that step one was kind of a proof of concept. Everything actually got wrapped up afterwards. So there's a lot of work to do following that point. But the question I ask is where do base rollups sit in this architecture? So option one is the gateway provides sequencing for rollups. So a gateway provider, be it chain bound through Bolt or Luban or even Puffer, provides this sequencing through a gateway of sorts. The two concerns about this is it becomes a bottleneck. Then we're putting the requirement on a single gateway to provide the sequencing for potentially thousands of rollups, thousands of base rollups. But let's just say 10 rollups is probably too much of an overhead, particularly for a rollup that's like Rise that we're trying to hit 100k TPS. So that alone is going to be a pain in the ass for the gateways to run. Next is likely in the early days for these based rollups, we're going to need to have permission training wheels. There's a few unknowns, and we're likely going to deploy things over time, and it's unlikely that the Venn diagram or the union of the trusted parties you're willing to sequence your transaction overlaps with the pre-conf providers, because they might be dodgy. Not saying that they are. Option two is where the rollups themselves essentially become a gateway. So what this would look like is they create the infrastructure to do this, but then they'd have to go around and essentially petition all of the validators, at least a decent sum of validators, to delegate rights to them to sequence their transactions. This is a massive BD hurdle. There's already a bunch of pre-conf teams that have put a lot of effort into this, and I think this is just too much of a barrier for rollups to really participate. So I don't think this is a hugely viable option. There may be some rollups that vertically integrate, but I don't think this will be the common approach. Option number 3, and this is what I think is actually the most viable, and that's where we have a secondary API. So at the top we've got the constraints API, and down the bottom we have what's been kind of coined the commitments API. And so this is where the gateway will provide some kind of a commitment to a based sequencer, one or likely tens and even hundreds of base sequences to sequence for the rollups. And this API hasn't been designed yet. I've spoken with the pre-conf teams, and I haven't seen one that's really fleshed out. There's a lot of flexibility in this. This can be an auction, could be like a subscription service. There's plenty of things you can do here to make this work. And so let's dig on this. And I call this multi-domain delegation. And the reason I'm introducing this term domain is because the gateway won't be delegating to individual sequences. They'll be delegating to domains, which may be a cluster of rollups. So for Spire or Tycho Gwyneth, they are going to be many, many rollups within their domain. Rise, for instance, we're a single rollup, so we're going to have our domain is a one-to-one. Now, the challenges that we face here is that this leads to a domain-only interop. So we essentially land with having the same like fiefdoms that we have today outside of the based ecosystem, just within the based ecosystem. So this is something that I really want to solve. The next is that it's high cost. So each of these domains, and you can picture many, many other rollups deploying in the space, have a high cost because you have to submit transactions every epoch, and I'll dig into that in a sec. And then because of that cost, there's a high barrier for entry. So primary challenges, on-chain cost and cross-domain synchronous composability. So on the on-chain costs, the high level here is that how base sequencing works to provide pre-confirmations is that there is a look-ahead period, that there's an upcoming epoch, you have some selection mechanism for deciding which validator that's participating in pre-confirmations will get permission to sequence or provide pre-confirmations for your rollup. But what this means is that you essentially have to submit a on-chain transaction every 6.5 minutes, so 32 Ethereum blocks. If you don't do that, you won't actually gain full liveness. So this is kind of the base level requirement to have full liveness. Otherwise, you'd have gaps where you couldn't actually provide any pre-confirmations for your rollup, or any confirmations at all, really. So what that looks like in total cost, I've put some gas numbers for proposing a block, proving a block on the side here. These are coming from Tycho's numbers. They're rough, so it's not accurate, but it provides us a good estimate. One thing to highlight, it's much cheaper for optimistic rollups, but what that looks like is about absolute minimum of 225 transactions per day. So that results in a daily cost of about 4K and a monthly cost of about 100K per domain. Now that's feasible for like Rise, that's kind of okay with us. We're going to be able to support that, but if you're building an app chain or something novel that you want to spin up, that's just going to be too cost prohibitive. And as an example, Tycho, which notably has a pretty inefficient design at the moment, and the team know this, and there's a future for that to be cheaper. They're essentially paying to be first, but they spent 115K yesterday just on their L1 cost, which is pretty wild. So the solution is amortizing this cost. Because we're using essentially the same sequences, there's a way we can bundle up a lot of these on-chain transactions to reduce the cost for everyone. What this means is that the more rollups that participate in these programs, the cheaper these costs are going to get. So for instance, on the state root submission, Rise could share that cost by creating a state root tree, for instance. Or for DA, you can do blob sharing, where you kind of bundle up the blobs. And this one's DA is a little bit nuanced, because the reason DA is expensive is most of the cost is just in the fixed cost of submitting the blob, because blobs are essentially free. It's just the 21K gas that you have to pay. And then proving as well. You can amortize cost improving by doing proof aggregations for ZK rollups. So what this looks like as just an example of how much you can bring the cost down. If you were to do 10 optimistic rollups that all shared state root and all shared DA, the DA submissions that is, you could get it down to about $30 a day or about $1,000 a day, $1,000 a month. And that's assuming a gas price of 20 gwei, so it's a somewhat ambitious gas price because it fluctuates quite a bit. So ultimately, I think the take back here is that even with just 10 rollups, this is getting very, very cheap to run rollups, and it's kind of cool future where you could deploy a base rollup very, very affordably. So the next challenge is cross-domain synchronous composability. So I just want to take a pause on this, that why I think this is so important, and it's because cross-domain synchronous composability within the based ecosystem really dials up the network effect. The network effect that this Metcalfe's law is that the value of the network is proportional to the square of the network, and there's a constant component to it. And I put this in like this constant K minus F. This is just an idea that this F could be a dampening effect, a friction in the ecosystem. And what I mean by that is that because there's not composability between these rollups or these domains, we're adding friction. So we're slowing down the growth and we're reducing the net value of the network. So that's why it's important to really have these rails between them. And then additionally to that, because we're sharing essentially block space demand in a sense, because there's composability between them. If a new rollup enters the based ecosystem, all the other rollups in the ecosystem kind of benefit from that because they're adding users or they're adding demand on their block space. If you're providing liquidity, if you have a high liquidity chain, an app chain might pull that liquidity, for instance. And yeah, ultimately lower costs. Major challenges with synchronous composability is doing it right with trustlessness. It's really hard to do it while not trusting the other domains. It gets a lot easier if you have real-time ZK proving, but we're a long way from that, particularly with high-performance chains. And then it also becomes a throughput bottleneck that ultimately if you're trying to do synchronous composability, particularly if you want execution pre-confirmations, is a nuance to that. There's going to be a bottleneck. You have to execute these blocks. They have to kind of like intertwine together, and you've got to distribute that amongst multiple cores or multiple machines. It's a very challenging task. And yeah, we need real-time proving. So that's kind of the, oh sorry, one thing I wanted to mention here, apologies. One thing I just want to shout out to, so Tycho Gwyneth, Breck just released a write-up about a generalized synchronous composability design that's really solid, and Ellie from Espresso has been working on something called Circ. So there are teams working on this and putting effort towards this, which is awesome. So in the future, it's kind of like forward-looking. Once we have solved these problems, I see a world where the demand for based sequencing essentially fills up all of the blocks, or every block in an epoch. And the really cool thing about this, and sorry, just to take a step back, the reason for that is say we have thousands of base rollups, or at least hundreds of base rollups, there's going to be a lot more demand on the Ethereum block space to sequence those blocks. It's still going to be cheap because there's so many of them, but there's a world where we can't start filling up all of the blocks. And the really cool thing about this is that's what unlocks L1, L2 execution pre-comps. So at the moment you can do L1, L2 execution pre-comps, but it's only for the small period, the 12-second period of the active slot. So you're going to get this like idle demand and then a spike when there is that one 12-second slot. Whereas if we start filling up all the slots, we have an always live. So we have liveness for L1, L2 pre-comps, which is pretty cool. And then another secondary effect is that you get to this zero-cost bootstrapping world, which is pretty exciting. So just quickly touch on the future work. This is just kind of like my to-do in the back of my head of what needs to get done and what I'd like to like encourage and work with other teams on to solve. So the constraints API, we were able to draft up a standard, which is awesome. There's going to be a call starting where we can keep pushing this along and have these teams together kind of come together to really formalize this and turn it into an ERC standard. Number 2 is this commitments API. And this, I'm not actually of the thought that this needs to be standardized immediately. There's a lot of unknowns here, and I'm of the thought that you've got to kind of let this flower bloom and see what designs work the best here. So there are a lot of teams that are working on this. I know Spire and Gwyneth have some ideas as well as Puffer, and also the pre-comp teams themselves. So I'm excited to see where that goes. Blobs, DA sharing, I think this one's fairly solvable. So I've spoken to each of these teams down here, and all of them are eager to work on this together and really come up with a design that everyone's happy with. And then finally on synchronous composability, I mentioned that Gwyneth and Espresso are working on it, and I also know the Polymer team are working with Espresso on Circ, which is exciting, but this is undoubtedly the hardest part, and a lot of work has to go into solving this. Awesome, thank you.
Any questions from the audience? Actually, I have one. You mentioned, I think early in the slides, base sequencing. You talked about how it was unique, and credible neutrality was one of those qualities. Are you saying that obviously the L1 provides credible neutrality, but another network that is powered by a BFT consensus, economically secure, that could also be considered credibly neutral, that acts as a decentralized sequencer?
Yeah, I can see the argument there, but I think if you're a roll-up, you've already made the decision to deploy on Ethereum, and by doing that, or if you're an Ethereum roll-up, that is, you're essentially coming to the conclusion that Ethereum is credibly neutral. Regardless, of who. I guess if you're then relying on a network on top of Ethereum, you're adding another party that you have to essentially trust. So credible neutrality might not be the right term, but it's essentially adding another party into the system.
Right. But yeah, you also mentioned about how, using alt DA, kind of the same argument there, right? If you're going to do it, might as well use blobs or.
That's right. And so there's flexibility in this. So you can use Ethereum DA, and there might be a world where you can only have synchronous composability, or you opt only to have synchronous composability with those that use Ethereum DA. So yeah, it's really up to the flavor of the rollup. Like they can still be building within this ecosystem while using Espresso for a sequencing component of it, and can be using an external DA as well. So I think there's flexibility there, but ultimately it comes down to the rollups deciding. It's kind of an opt-in rather than a enforced participation, I think, is the key difference.
So you think base rollups can still kind of live within or use like a modular stack, or do you think it's kind of a counter, like a?
I think the answer to that is really where you sit on the ETH is money camp.
Yeah.
And I fall in the ETH is money camp rather than revenue being the driver of ETH's value. So yeah, I think I consider it modularity within the base ecosystem being important. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.